transgender movement, which is this sense that if I'm to be free to make my own choices and be free from constraint, well, that includes even the constraint of my own body. If you buy this idea like I should be able to choose whatever I want, then at some point you say, well, hang on a second, I didn't get to choose whether I was male or female. That's not fair. I just got stuck with that. What if I want to be able to choose?
You're saying that comfort is so accessible here in the United States, and that comfort leads to an apathetic spirit.
Discipleship really is just making a choice to be a Christ follower and submitting your life every day to the call of God on your life.
Our mission is to disciple young leaders just like you, helping you become everything God has called you to be. We're here to have authentic conversations about the real topics that our generation wrestles with, whether it's how to share the gospel, what it means to be a true disciple, or how to navigate faith in today's world. Our goal is to equip you with the tools, knowledge, and wisdom you need to lead in your generation. Join us every other week as we learn to be next-gen leaders together.
Welcome to the 1630 Show. I'm your host, Abby Sexton. We are a discipleship ministry developing next-gen leaders just like you to grow and thrive in the calling God has placed on your life. We want you to understand your identity in the Lord, walk with you as you discover God's calling, and send you out on mission as the leader God calls you to be. Together, we can pray, vote, and engage to leave a lasting impact on our nation. Today, we are joined by Brad Littlejohn. Brad is Director of Programs and Education at the American Compass and Coalition's Advisor for the Digital Childhood Alliance. Previously, he served as a Fellow of the Ethics and Policy Center, and he is President of the Devenant Institute. A leading voice in Protestant ethics and political thought, he has authored or edited 19 books, including Call to Freedom and the forthcoming I Think Therefore I Am. His work on technology, ethics, and public policy has appeared in National Affairs, First Things, The New Atlantis, and more. He is a regular columnist at World Opinions, and he lives in London County, Virginia, with his wife and 4 children. Let's listen to my conversation with Brad Littlejohn. Well, Brad, thank you so much for being on the show today. I appreciate you being here.
Thanks, my pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, can you start off just telling us a little bit about your background and about what you do now?
Yeah, so my background, I did a PhD in theology, theological ethics, at the University of Edinburgh. Finished that up in 2013, 2014. I started a nonprofit called the Devenant Institute, a kind of sort of a theological education think tank seeking to kind of bring together pastors and Christian leaders and scholars to deepen and enrich contemporary Protestant discourse, especially in matters of Christian ethics. I did that for a decade, actually, but then gradually got more involved in the kind of DC think tank world, actually uh, doing a little bit of public policy work. And now I work full time as director of programs at a conservative think tank called American Compass. So.
Awesome. Okay, that's awesome. Well, you've written this book, Called to Freedom, Retrieving Christian Liberty in an Age of License. I'm super excited to talk about this topic. I think it's just so relevant to our culture today, especially to young people as well. I think it's really important for us to be aware of what that truly means. But can you start off just telling us what led you to want to write this book?
Yeah, I think I was just struck by the disconnect between the way that we often, I think, I say in the book, we kind of have these two different parallel worlds of discourse where kind of when we're wearing our church hat and doing our piety talk, we say things like, true freedom is found in Christ. There's a prayer in the Book of Common Prayer. My own tradition, the Anglican tradition, that says, to serve God is perfect freedom. And that sentiment, we all be like, yeah, absolutely. I've like serving Jesus, following Jesus is what it means to be fully free. And yet, most of the rest of our lives, certainly our kind of broad cultural and political discourse, freedom means being free to do whatever you want. Not necessarily what you ought to do, but just, nobody else being able to tell you what to do. So it's like, on the one hand, we have this view of freedom that's like, freedom means being able to do what Christ tells you to do, and narrow is the way.
Mm.
And then this other field of discourse which says freedom means being able to do, not have to do what anyone else tells you to do. So, I realized that, and Christians themselves will switch back and forth, I feel like, between both discourses without really recognizing the tension. So that kind of just, set me on a kind of journey of investigation, essentially is this like just one of those words that means two totally different things in different contexts, or is there actually is there a coherent way to speak about freedom that can bridge the kind of spiritual and political worlds?
Hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting. Well, in your book and in the first chapter, you talk about that we're all slaves to something, right? That's the way it works, and that's not something that people really want to acknowledge for sure. But I do want to read this verse from Romans, Romans 6:17 through 18, that says, "But thanks be to God that you who were once slaves of sin have become obedient from the heart to the standard of teaching to which you were committed, and having been set free from sin, have become slaves of righteousness." And so, can you just talk about that verse a little bit too? Because I think that's really, really important that we acknowledge that we all serve something, we are all slaves to something. That's a hard thing to wrap our minds around, but can you address that a little bit?
Yeah. So, again, I think the way we tend to think of it is freedom is threatened by anyone outside of you um, being able to tell you what to do, force you to do something. But we don't often recognize the fact to which our freedom can be threatened. And in fact, the deepest threats to our freedom are the ones that come from inside of us, from our own desires. As scripture says, you are, overpowered by your desires and enslaved by them. And we all know this, of course, experientially. We know that plenty of times we at one level want to do something, at one level want to do the right thing, and then find ourselves constantly falling back into patterns of behavior that we recognize to be self-destructive. I think we can all read Romans 7 and identify with how Paul describes that experience. And so we know that whatever freedom is, it's something that can be lost from within as well as from without, that there's something inside of us that can enslave us. And that is, of course, the power of sin. And so scripture teaches that before we can even talk about freedom in kind of the external social and political context, we have to think about freedom in that internal context of what does it mean to be set free from the power of sin.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so good. Well, we kind of have this obsession with freedom in America, right? That is just something that we all care about a lot. And so, can you kind of talk about what are some ways that you see that playing out in our culture right now? Why do you think we have this obsession with freedom, being able to, by the world standards, live the way that we want? And then, just what are some examples that you have seen in our culture of that happening?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I think the most extreme form in which it presents itself is well, the most extreme form in which it's sort of presented itself thus far has been kind of the transgender movement, which is this sense that if I'm to be free to make my own choices and be free from constraint, well, that includes even the constraint of my own body. If you buy this idea like I should be able to choose whatever I want, then at some point you say, well, hang on a second, I didn't get to choose whether I was male or female. That's not fair. I just got stuck with that. What if I want to be able to choose, right? And so that people just take that idea of freedom and they run with it and say, okay, that means that I need to be able to reconstruct even my own body in order to exercise my freedom, right? Or I'd say, maybe an even more extreme form, which is starting to be normalized, less so in the U.S., but much more so in Canada, is the freedom to just end your life altogether, right? The whole assisted suicide movement is again a manifestation of this idea of freedom. If freedom means being able to choose anything, then that should include choosing to terminate your life whenever you no longer find it,
Hmm.
worthwhile to live.
Hmm.
So those are, those are the extreme manifestations, but I think they're the extreme manifestations of a spirit that presents itself to us in all sorts of subtle and insidious ways that we don't. I think most conservative Christians are like, oh yeah, we're against euthanasia, we're against transgenderism, but they don't realize how much every day they nonetheless kind of subconsciously imbibe this
Mm.
idea of I need to be able to maximize my choices, and the world needs to be, you know, cater to my, cater to my desires. And I think churches fall into that. I think churches have, for at least a generation in America, really kind of fallen into this consumer mentality. They are to offer, yeah, as much as possible, a range of different choices. We might have different service times and different service types, different all kinds of different groups you can get involved in. Which, I mean, obviously, to some extent, it makes sense to have like a young adults group and a seniors group and so on and so forth. But you get these part of part of the draw of these mega churches is you've got a church of 5,000 people, 10,000 people. It's able to offer this massive menu of options. So you can just, choose between any one of like 15 different services to attend, and one of 30 different community groups to be a part of. And and there's the perhaps the this starts with the coffee shop in the church,
Yep.
church atrium, where you can choose 50 different, kinds of latte or whatever, right? And so the church is helping catechize people in this idea of freedom as having the maximum menu of options to choose between. And then it makes it very hard for us when the world comes to us within these extreme conclusions, to know how to respond.
No, that's so good. And I definitely want to dive into that a little bit more because I feel like we see a lot in the American church today of that consumer mentality that you were talking about. It's a lot of showing up on Sunday and really that's it, leaving and kind of living their lives the way they want the rest of the week. There's a lot of feelings based churches out there these days as well, versus really pointing people back to biblical truth, which I think is really concerning. But just something that I've kind of seen just throughout my life is that people tend to be either this kind of legalistic heavy or grace heavy. I think we struggle with knowing what true, just like you're talking about, what true biblical freedom actually means. And I've seen a lot more of the grace heavy things myself personally. I know that there are issues with the legalistic side of things too. Like I hear people say all the time, this is one of my pet peeves, is in Ephesians. People love to bring up Ephesians 2, 8, and 9, which talks about, we are saved by grace alone. There's, not of your own works, that no one may boast. But then we leave off verse 10, which says that we were created in Christ Jesus to do good works, which he created in advance for us to do. So that doesn't mean that we don't have to do anything. Now, we're not saved by those things, but then we do have things that we are called to do, and we are to act a certain way. And Scripture addresses those things. So can you kind of talk about that a little bit? Have you seen that? What are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, and I think the dominant, definitely both problems.
Yeah.
And some people have grown up in more one background than the other, and people are sort of always reacting against whichever background they grew up
Yep.
in. I do think that the kind of antinomian impulse, the jettisoning the law, grace is all you need, it is the more dominant one. And we've sometimes forgotten, we've made grace cheap in a sense. I like to emphasize to people the reason that Luther's discovery of justification by faith alone was so impactful is that Luther had a deep, deep visceral sense of the wrath of God against sin. Right? It was like, I I know that, like, God really, really hates sin, and I deserve to be destroyed, and that's why it's so amazing that I have this
Mm-hmm.
great forgiveness. And I feel like what's happened in so much, American evangelicalism today is we've actually lost that. We sort of think, oh yeah, God's not really that angry about sin. God's not, like God's full of grace and mercy, right? And so so of course we would expect God to forgive us, right? Which is like it's sort of like as soon as like you expect God to forgive you, that takes all of the wonder out of it, right?
Right.
So it's like the grace, the greatness of grace only makes sense against the backdrop of real understanding of the greatness of sin. And if you really understand the greatness of sin, then just because you've been saved by grace, you're not going to want to go back to sin, right?
Mm.
Uh, Now, I think that where the legalism can become a problem, and this is where I try to steer a different course in my book, is I think that while we're called to good works, we're we're not usually given a great deal of specificity in Scripture about what those good works look like,
Mm.
and it's going to be very different in our particular contexts and callings what it means to live out those good works.
Mm-hmm.
And what tends to happen is that churches that are really serious about, you know, um, enforcing biblical morality, they fall into Pharisaism, and the key
Yeah.
thing, remember the thing about the Pharisees, the big issue there was that they were wasn't that they were zealous for following God's law. That's great. Jesus says that's great, but I want you to be as zealous for following God's law as the Pharisees. Is that they made up a whole bunch of extra laws that then they gave the same authority as God's law. They're like,
Hmm.
here's our 150 extra rules, and these are all basically should be treated as God's law as well. And so then you have the they could even be they might even be useful things, right? It's not
Mm.
even some of the elements of Pharisaical morality may have been useful practices, but there's a difference between something being a useful practice and being a practice commanded by God. And when a church confuses those two and starts calling its people to something and saying, "Thus saith the Lord," if the Lord hasn't said so, that's where I think you get into real spiritual danger, and people recognize there's something wrong, and that's when people often
Mm.
react against that. So I think what we need to recover is this idea that it's important for churches as communities of believers to pursue holiness together, and that means creating disciplines. And I can talk more about this later, but creating disciplines that we follow as a community, as a
Mm.
manifestation of our corporate liberty as believers, um, and yet um, without over prescribing those as if they're straightforward biblical commands. I
Mm.
think to be able to say, we think this is a sort of a judgment of Christian wisdom. We exhort you to do this with us.
Hmm.
Um, but we recognize a distinction between what Christ has said and these wisdom calls.
Yeah, no, that's really good. Yeah, I would love to hear more about those disciplines because I know you talk about this kind of individual freedom and then corporate freedom as well in the book. And so, can you kind of talk about the difference there too and what that looks like in the church community?
Yeah, so I think that's something that's we've lost some in our discourse about freedom too, is we think freedom is something only exercised by individuals um, over against communities, and we tend to think that then being subject to the life of a community is always kind of a threat to my freedom. I'm forced to conform. I can't express myself. I can't be myself. And yet, this obviously isn't quite right, because we start thinking about like what is it like what are the greatest expressions of our freedom that we often find the greatest fulfillment in. And we can think about some people it might be playing sports, for other people it might be playing a musical instrument, uh, and both of these things, think about it, are things that require at least the vast you can have a solo sport and you can be a solo musical performer, but tend to be things that you do as part of a team or as part of an orchestra, in which your freedom actually is experienced by submitting yourself to the whole ensemble, right? And playing your part within it. And by doing that, you're actually able to produce something more beautiful or achieve something greater than you could have ever achieved just doing your own thing, right? But there's the freedom of the community acting as a whole, the freedom of a football team to be able to score goals, right? Requires that every player understand what role he's supposed to play in terms of running this particular play, right? The freedom of an orchestra to play a symphony requires that the violinist doesn't just shoot off on their own just
Hmm.
because great melody came to their head, right? And we do this in church all the time. Actually, I think I think I use this example in the book. I was once upon a time at a youth group that I think said like, okay, everybody, I want everybody to think of your favorite praise song and just start belting it out, right? So you just have the cacophony of people trying to
Mm.
sing over each other, which means none of us were actually free to sing, really, right? Right. So to be free to sing praises to God, um, we have to accept like the worship leader saying, "This is what we're going to sing next," right? And that's actually a submission to authority that facilitates a deeper form of freedom. And we recognize that, but we don't talk about it and think about it enough, and it tends to be and we're suspicious of it in a church that establishes a liturgy. We see that as a threat to Christian liberty, but in fact, churches that have a full-fledged liturgy, that's really just a working out of that principle that like we are freed to worship by the worship leader choosing the hymns or praise songs for the day. Um, so I think we need to think more about that and be willing to extend that principle and say, what are the ways in which actually we have we are missing out on things that we could experience because we are not willing to set aside our personal preferences to do things as a community,
Mm.
and what are individual freedoms that we could give up in order to experience a higher freedom in community together.
Mm.
um, and I think, I mean, one of the things I talk about in the book is our relationship to technology. I think churches could play a really great role here, and just saying, like, there's a lot of schools now that are catching on very blatantly and saying, hey, it's not helpful to have smartphones in the classroom. We want students are required to leave those at the door. um, I don't see a reason why churches shouldn't do the same thing. Say, you don't need your smartphone in here. I mean, I think unfortunately many churches have gone the opposite. Like, you do need your smartphone. Here's the QR code you need to scan to give or to follow along. I think, say you don't need your smartphone in here to worship. Leave your smartphone in the car. Come here, be fully present for one another. And I think we'd all actually experience a greater freedom
Mm.
through that. And I think that's where I'm saying, like, that's not legalistic, because you
Mm.
don't say that in terms, you don't say, because this Bible verse says, right? You don't, but you say, look, guys, our in our sort of sanctified Christian wisdom, this seems like fruitful for our life together. So let's decide together to do this, right? Um, and so it's an exercise of our corporate freedom. It's not a form of legalism.
Hmm. That's really interesting. Well, another thing that you point back to in the book repeatedly is just going back to different reformers and what they said. I think it's so important that we look back at church history and know what different theologians have said. And so I love that you bring up the reformers. And so I'm just curious if there are some insights from some of those leaders like Martin Luther or John Calvin that you talk about that would have an effect on maybe our cultural moment, some insights of things that they had to say that we should really take to heart.
Hmm. Yeah, I think the two that I probably lean on the most are Luther, and then Richard Hooker, who I did my doctoral work on, the
Hmm.
English theologian. I think the big thing to get from Luther is this idea. So I kind of make this distinction between, talked about here earlier in the interview, the kind of distinction, kind of an inward freedom and an outward freedom. But even within the inward freedom, there's kind of a distinction that has to be made within that between spiritual and moral freedom that Luther emphasizes, which is to say that there's being freed from the power of particular sins. I might, have an alcohol addiction or something that is a particular sin that I pray for the Spirit's aid in overcoming. But there's something more fundamental than that, which is the freedom to, or the bondage to the power of sin, um, as such, which is the power, which is essentially the the feeling of guilt, right? So the fundamental thing is this sense of alienation from God, this sense of being unworthy, this sense of being deserving of death, and therefore this sense of kind of crippling fear. Is anything I do, and we all, I think, Luther is actually can speak very directly, I think, to sort of some of our modern um, neuroses. That there's just this sense of, does anything that I do matter?
Mm.
And this sense of kind of futility that we have often. And Luther recognizes that as that is the fundamental um, kind of threat to our freedom and the kind of inmost level. Like, do I even have the freedom to be an agent? And that is made possible by accepting the the free promise of forgiveness and justification by faith. It's the freedom from having to prove myself through my works, right? So we do want to grow in good works and overcoming particular habits of sin. But before you can do that, you have to be freed from the um, the sense of necessity to do good works. You will only actually be able to do good works in a sustainable way if you're not depending upon those good works Right. So that's Luther's like fundamental insight, right? I'm just sort of I'm restating here what the doctrine of justification by faith is, but I think sometimes we just sort of repeat that, justification by faith, and we don't really sort of wrestle through it existentially in the way that Luther did. And I think everybody should read Martin Luther's On the Freedom of a Christian. It's very short,
Mm.
very readable, and it's I remember I can't remember when I first read it. I first read it in college, and I think again it was like I guess I read it in college. I don't know. I remember actually in grad school reading it for the first time properly and being like, I've been sort of repeating this mantra, justification by faith, my whole life. Grew up in a Reformed Christian home, but like I feel like I finally understand it.
Mm.
So that's important. Then I think what Hooker really brings to the table is this distinction I made between individual and corporate liberty, and Hooker is really keen to say, how can we hold on to that? Everything Luther has said about the freedom of the individual Christian conscience before God, without turning us all into individualists who are just each our own isolated conscience, paying attention to God, but not paying attention to one another, which isn't what Luther intended, but it's how some people kind of took his gospel,
Mm.
or his portrayal of the gospel. So Hooker really emphasizes this element of how does a community corporately exercise Christian freedom in a way that actually enhances the moral freedom of its members?
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's really interesting. Well, I want to shift gears a little bit. I know you briefly mentioned the technology aspect, but I want to get into that a little bit more as well. I know you have various chapters in the book, and so you have one on technology specifically. And I wish we could dive into all the chapters of your book because it's all really interesting and fascinating. This is just a brief overview. But on the technology chapter, I think it's just really relevant today and to young people as well. I mean, young people today, I mean, I think I got on Instagram in like seventh grade, right? I mean, a lot of people just started that so young. This generation did. And so, can you just kind of talk about what you're seeing in our culture today in terms of technology? Because I know that you talk about it can really, it's not necessarily a bad thing, right? It's not inherently sinful, but it's not. It can be used very incorrectly. And so, what are you kind of seeing today in our culture on that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you say used incorrectly. I mean, I think the problem is in some cases people are using these things correctly in the sense of using them as they were designed. I mean, I think some
Mm,
of these platforms, like Instagram, are designed very self-consciously to say, how can we get people to spend the maximum amount of time and emotional energy on this platform?
yeah.
Um, which is to say, they're not designed as tools, which is we always sort of reach this metaphor. We say, oh, technology is a tool, right? But you think like a hammer is designed actually like a good tool is designed to make you use it as little time as possible. Think about it, right? Like a really bad hammer is one that uh or maybe let's think of it. It's hard to think what a bad hammer would be. Think of like a bad screwdriver, or the bad screw or whatever. It's like somewhat stripped, and so it takes forever to screw it in, right? Uh, one that's really well designed and working well, you take it out, you use it, you finish the job, you put it away, right? So time on device is minimized really in an effective tool, but these things are designed to maximize time on device, right?
Yeah.
Which means they're not serving as a tool for anything really, except as the only thing they're serving as a tool toward is our a kind of emotional they're trying to fill this emotional hole, which is then it's infinite because it's sort of we're always digging the hole as fast as we're digging ourselves out
Mm,
of it, looking for this sense of affirmation from other people
hmm.
that the digital medium can't actually provide because it's actually pulling us away. Every minute that we're spending on that device is pulling us away from the physical embodied relationships where we're actually going to find that meaningful affirmation, right? Um, so I think it's the technology sphere is one where I think it really helps make some of my key theses in the book really really clear to people in a way that maybe wouldn't have been clear 15 to 20 years ago. Right, this point that the biggest threat to our freedom is often our um, our own action that we
Mm,
can that the phenomenon of addiction. All of us are sort of recognized like everybody's addicted to something these days. All of us are sort of somewhat addicted to our devices. Some of us more than others. Uh, and the addiction is this sense of like doing something compulsively, even though you would kind of rather not do it, right? Which is obviously not the experience of freedom. But what's interesting is how often these things are sold to us in terms of freedom, right? This is a way that you can be yourself, that you can create your own story, that you can, and even like actually, I mean, the newest form of these, I think I saw some study recently that three-quarters of American teens had used like AI companion bots, and like some of these
Mhm.
websites that they'll say like this, y- they will sell themselves to someone to users in this language of freedom and autonomy and self-realization. Let's write your own story. Let's write a story together or whatever, right? Uh, and of course, that's not what they're doing. They're not increasing your autonomy. They're taking it away from you by making you more and more dependent. And I think that we are, going back to the distinction I made at the beginning. We think, oh, the freedom threat to freedom is other people being able to tell me what to do. And so as long as I'm deciding what to do, then I'm free. But as I said, you can lose your freedom by listening to yourself if you're listening to the wrong desires within you. And crucially, whenever you do that, you actually become more subject to other people, right? The person who is enslaved by sin is much easier for someone else to manipulate, right? The person who is, as Paul says, a slave to righteousness, who only cares what Jesus thinks of him, is therefore unable to be manipulated by any other person,
Mm.
unable to be intimidated by any other person. Uh, but when you are a slave to your desires, then anybody who wants to control you can just say, aha, this person's a slave to alcohol. This person's a slave to sex. This person's a slave to Instagram, whatever. If I want to get this person to do what I want, I just have to use that whatever that thing is that they are enslaved to. And so every time we use these technologies ostensibly to maximize our own freedom and autonomy, what we're actually doing is allowing ourselves to be used by companies that are,
Mm.
minting money off of off of our attention.
Yeah. I know you brought up AI, and I think that's a really relevant topic to this generation as well. That's just exploded. I mean, when I was in college, that wasn't even a thing, and now it's everywhere. But I mean, with these different things, as you said, people are using them correctly, how they're were intended to be used by these companies. But I guess how can we use them incorrectly? What are some practical ways that Christians can really utilize this technology in a healthy way without it letting it really rule their lives?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the answer there is one answer at least is to come back to what I said, this tool metaphor, and say, okay, if you actually want to use this as a tool to accomplish certain objectives, then what does it take to use a tool well? Uh, well, usually it takes a certain amount of strength and skill. And the more powerful the tool is, the more strength and skill it takes to use it. So to use a screwdriver, pretty easy. You can, an 8-year-old can play around with a screwdriver. To use a chainsaw, not so much, right? You have to have a certain amount of strength and skill to be able to use that tool. Um, and so I think recognizing that our most powerful technologies are probably are ones that they might be useful. They might well be useful, but we should sort of have the self awareness to. I mean, as a parent, I should say, look, if I want my child to be able to use this tool well, then that means not giving it to him until an age when I'm confident that he can, or and not going straight to this, giving him something easier, and then gradually helping him build up the kind of digital skills to be able to use it, talk to an AI chatbot and get it to do useful things for him rather than using it to kind of um, in a way that actually undermines his capacities, right? Because every time Um, yeah, I mean, I think we should ask ourselves the question: Am I using this technology? Am I using this technology to make me stronger and more effective for all the things God's called me to do? Uh, and in a sense, any technology, the reason it's adopted at all is it makes it easier to do certain things. And if makes it easier to do something, you could say, well, you know, um, for instance, going from a screwdriver to a drill, I guess it requires more effort to use the screwdriver than to use the drill. And so if you're just using a power drill, are you losing your strength because you're having the technology to do much of the work for you? Um, you know, if you're on a construction crew, maybe yes in the narrow sense, but you do that because it actually frees up some time for then you can then use other more difficult tools to do other more difficult tasks, and so on.
Hmm.
And so that's the correct use of technology to say, how does this actually um, help me free me up to do higher and tasks that actually call on more and more of my capacities. But that requires a lot of thought and a lot of self knowledge and a lot of self discipline, because what we tend to do otherwise is we just use the thing that means we have to use less effort, and then we never actually learn to develop the muscles, the physical muscles or the mental muscles that we otherwise would develop. And so we just, instead of becoming stronger and more capable, we become less and less capable and more dependent. And so, I mean, I think just, you see this quite practically in terms of how, college students are using chat gpt. It is certainly possible to use chat gpt if you've already learned how to think and already learned how to write. You can use chat gpt to write and think faster. But if you haven't, but even then you have to be careful, because you can start to actually lose your capacity even if you already developed it. But certainly if you haven't developed the capacity to begin with, if you haven't really learned how to think and haven't really learned how to write, and you're just using this as a shortcut, then you'll never learn how to think and you'll never learn how to write, and you won't even actually be able to use this technology effectively.
That's so interesting. Well, if you could just distill your book's message down into kind of one statement, or maybe just a major takeaway for our young adults who are listening to this, who are believers wanting to live out that biblical freedom in the culture today, even though, it's a lot of times difficult to do that. There's a lot of backlash, there's a lot of pushback on that. But what takeaway would you share with our young people listening about this biblical freedom?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most important verse, I cite this in the book, is from Second Peter 2:19. Um, they promise them freedom, but they themselves are slaves of corruption. For whatever overcomes a person, to that he is enslaved. And this idea, even then, in that context, Peter recognized that believers are being fooled by people who are promising freedom to them, saying, "Hey, do it. Listen to me, and you're going to be free. Don't listen to this Peter guy. He just wants to, you know, he's just looking for power. And that's what young people today are told: is don't listen to authority figures in their lives. They're just power hungry. They're just seeking to control you because they're afraid of, they're afraid of you, and they don't want you to be yourself. And so everyone in the world today is promising our young people freedom, but it's this freedom, again, the freedom of being slaves of corruption. It's the freedom that consists in just follow your desires wherever they take you, and where that is always going to take you is down a path of addiction and self-destruction. And when that you follow that path, as I said, you other people are able to control you. You are not actually being set free from other people. When you rebel against authority, go to your own thing, you pretty soon find you are not doing your own thing. You are doing something some company wants you to do because they're making a lot of money off.
Mm, yeah, absolutely. Well, any last thoughts for our young adult listeners?
Nope. Aside from the reminder, I'm serious. Just you should read Luther's Freedom of a Christian.
Yep.
It'll take you an hour, change your life if you haven't read it before.
That's awesome. Well, Brad, thank you for being here and for talking about this really important topic. I really appreciate your insight. Just really, really important for our generation to understand what biblical freedom really is and have that biblical foundation for everything that we do. So I appreciate you being here and sharing. And we'll have the book posted in the episode when it's released, and so that way people can figure out where to buy it. But we really appreciate you being here and sharing.
Yep, thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us today as we discuss with Brad Littlejohn what biblical freedom truly is, and thank you for letting us be a part of your life as you become all that God has called you to be. Be sure to like, subscribe, download our episodes, share them with a friend. You can follow us on social media at CE_1630 to see what we're up to, and check out our website, ce1630.org, to learn more about our programs, including our Washington, D.C. trip, free classes, and more. 1630 is an initiative of Christians Engaged, a ministry of Family Policy Alliance Foundation. Please consider supporting the ministry at ce1630.org or christiansengaged.org. Your support empowers this work. We'll see you next time.